In the summer of 1971, a 17-year-old with 40 hours a week at the Sunoco station and a paper route before school could walk onto a used car lot, count out $1,100 in cash, and drive home in a 1969 Camaro SS. Not a poster on his bedroom wall. Not a fantasy he'd chase into his 30s once the mortgage was paid off. An actual car, sitting in his actual driveway, bought with money he actually earned pumping gas for other people's muscle cars. That was the deal, for about a decade in America. And then, quietly, without anyone declaring it over, the deal ended. It's worth sitting with how ordinary this once was. By the early 70s, the muscle car boom of the 60s had already produced hundreds of thousands of Camaros, Chevelles, Mustangs, GTOs, and Road Runners, and those cars were aging into the used market exactly as a new generation of teenagers was coming of age with jobs and driver's licenses. A 3 or 4-year-old muscle car wasn't a collector's item. It was just a used car, depreciating the way used cars do, and depreciating fast, because gas was cheap and nobody was thinking about resale value on a car built to be driven hard. A kid working part-time at a gas station, a grocery store, a garage, could realistically save enough over a summer, sometimes less, to buy one outright or make a down payment a local bank wouldn't blink at, and it wasn't just about transportation. Owning that car was the entire architecture of teenage independence in that era. It's what got you to the drive-in, to the diner parking lot where everyone parked in a loose horseshoe and left their windows down, to the girl or the guy you were trying to impress, to the open stretch of 2-lane road outside town where you could finally find out what the car could do. The muscle car was a rite of passage precisely because it was earned. You didn't inherit it. You didn't get it as a graduation gift from parents with money. You worked a job that smelled like gasoline and rubber, you counted your bills at the end of the summer, and the car was the proof that you'd crossed some invisible line into being a person who could provide for himself. That mattered. It mattered in a way that's hard to fully explain to anyone who grew up after it stopped being true. Then, in October of 1973, the OPEC oil embargo hit, and the ground shifted under all of it. Gas prices that had sat around 30 cents a gallon for years suddenly climbed, then climbed again, and Americans sat in gas lines that wrapped around city blocks, watching attendants hang no gas signs on the pumps. A car with a big block V8 that got 8 or 10 miles to the gallon went, almost overnight, from a badge of freedom to a genuine financial liability. It wasn't that the cars became illegal or impossible to find. It's that the whole economic logic underneath them buckled. A working-class kid budgeting his gas station paycheck now had to reckon with the fact that the car itself might eat half of what he earned just to keep the tank full. The insurance industry moved almost as fast as the gas lines formed, and in some ways did more lasting damage. Actuaries had been watching accident and claims data on high-performance cars driven by young male drivers for years, and by the mid-70s, insurers started applying what amounted to a muscle car surcharge. It didn't matter if you'd never gotten a ticket. If you were 19 years old and the car had a 4-barrel carburetor and a name like Road Runner or Chevelle SS, your premium could run higher than your car payment, sometimes higher than the value of the car itself. For a lot of families, that was the real end of the line. Not the sticker price of the car, but the phone call to the insurance agent that came after. And underneath both of those shocks, a slower, quieter change was happening under the hood. The Clean Air Act amendments of the early 70s forced automakers to start controlling tailpipe emissions, and the easiest, cheapest way to hit those targets with the engine technology of the time was to lower compression ratios and detune engines, which meant horsepower numbers that had been climbing for a decade suddenly went into free fall. A 1970 GTO could be rated at 370 horsepower. By 1975, engines wearing the same nameplates, sometimes the exact same displacement, were being rated at half that or less. By 1974, catalytic converters became mandatory on new cars, which meant leaded high-octane fuel was being phased out too, and the whole recipe that had made muscle cars fast in the first place was being dismantled piece by piece, not by any single law banning them, but by a dozen smaller regulations stacking on top of each other. By the back half of the 70s, the new cars wearing muscle car names were, by and large, not muscle cars anymore. They were personal luxury coupes and disco-era styling exercises with engines that couldn't get out of their own way. Car and Driver and Motor Trend spent those years writing eulogies in real time, testing cars that took 9, 10, 11 seconds to reach 60 miles an hour, numbers that would have embarrassed a family sedan a few years earlier. The era later got the nickname the Malaise era, and it's a fitting one, because that's exactly what it felt like. Not a crisis. A slow draining of energy out of something that used to feel alive, which brings us to the used market, and the real closing of the door for that working-class teenager. As the 70s wore into the 80s, the good used muscle cars from the 60s didn't get cheaper the way ordinary used cars do. They started, slowly at first, to hold their value and then climb. Enthusiasts and early collectors began recognizing that these cars weren't going to be made again, not with that displacement, not with that horsepower, not under those looser regulations, and scarcity started doing what scarcity does to price. A car that might have sold for a few $100s as a beater in 1974 could be worth real money by 1982, restored or not. The same insurance surcharges that had made new performance cars unaffordable applied just as hard to a well-preserved '69 Camaro, maybe harder, since insurers didn't care how old the car was, only what it could do. The math that had worked for a gas station kid in 1971 simply didn't exist anymore. The cars were gone from the affordable end of the market, priced out from both directions at once, rising as collectibles while insurance and fuel costs made ownership harder for exactly the young, first-time buyers who used to be the natural customer. What replaced the ritual wasn't nothing. Kids in the early 80s still wanted fast cars, still wanted that same feeling of independence, and some found it in smaller, lighter machines, or in the survivors of the muscle era that automakers kept limping along, like the Trans Am, which held on to some of its swagger even as it got smaller and lighter under emissions rules. But it wasn't the same rite of passage. A new Trans Am cost real money, financed over years, not saved for over a summer. The used muscle cars that remained affordable tended to be the ones nobody wanted, the 6-cylinder Novas and the base model Furies, cars that had never been fast to begin with. The specific and very American promise, that a teenager with a summer job and enough patience could put himself behind the wheel of something genuinely powerful, quietly stopped being true, and nobody sent out an announcement when it happened. It just got a little harder every year, until one day it wasn't possible anymore, and the kids coming up after that never knew it had ever been any different. There's something worth sitting with in that. We tend to think of rites of passage as things that get replaced by other things, evolving rather than disappearing outright. But this one really did just end, squeezed out between an oil crisis, an insurance industry doing exactly what insurance industries do, and a set of emissions rules that, whatever their environmental merits, never once considered what they were taking away from a 17-year-old with grease under his fingernails and a summer's worth of paychecks in his pocket. Somewhere out there, those original cars are still around, sitting in garages now, worth more than the houses some of their first owners grew up in. And the last generation that got to buy one the old way, with a summer job and a handshake and cash on the hood, is the only generation that will ever fully understand what was lost when that door quietly swung shut.